On the edge of Workington, near the Cumbrian coast, Britain once built a factory that looked like the future. It was not a relic from the Victorian age. It was not an old workshop hidden behind rows of terraced houses. It was new, deliberate and ambitious. A purpose-built plant designed to manufacture a bus for the whole country. Inside the Lillyhall factory, steel glass engines, wiring, seats, paint, and skilled hands came together to produce one of the most familiar vehicles on British roads, the Leyland National. For passengers, it was simply the bus that arrived at the stop. For Workington, it was something much larger. It was employment. It was technical skill. It was industrial pride. It was proof that a town shaped by coal, iron, steel, docks, and railways could still have a place in Britain's modern economy. The idea seemed powerful. Take a town with a deep industrial workforce, build one of Europe's most advanced bus plants, and use it to supply a new generation of public transport. But less than 25 years after the factory was established, the promise began to fail, the production lines slowed, orders weakened, jobs were cut. The plant that had once been built to secure the future of British bus manufacturing became another name in the long retreat of British industry. The question is not only why Workington's bus factory closed. The deeper question is why a factory, created as part of the answer, became part of the problem it was supposed to solve. To understand that, you have to begin before the buses. Workington was never just a bus town. Long before the Leyland National appeared, this part of West Cumbria already understood heavy industry. The area had coal, iron ore, labour, water, rail connections, and access to the Irish Sea. In industrial Britain, those things mattered. Geography could decide the fate of a town. A dock was not just water. A railway was not just track. A port was not just a place where ships arrived. Together, they formed a system, the kind of system that allowed raw materials to come in, finished goods to go out, and whole communities to build their identity around work. Workington's older industrial story was iron and steel. Hematite iron ore helped make the town an important centre of production. Lonsdale Dock was built in the 19th century to handle that trade, and as the iron and steel industry expanded, the docks grew with it. That history matters because it shaped the culture into which the bus factory arrived. Workington was not being introduced to industry in the 1970s. It was being asked to change industries. The product changed. The rhythm changed. The technology changed. But the promise was familiar: a large employer, skilled work, national demand, and a factory whose output connected the town to the wider world. For generations, Workington had helped make the physical infrastructure of modern life. Rails made in the town travelled far beyond Cumbria. They carried trains, freight, passengers and commerce across Britain and beyond. The town's labour was embedded in movement itself, so when buses began leaving Lillyhall, the symbolism was powerful. Workington had once helped build the railways. Now it would help build the vehicles that carried people through cities, towns, estates, villages and suburbs. The bus factory did not arrive in an empty landscape. It arrived in a place already familiar with the pride of being useful to the country, and already familiar with the fear that usefulness could be taken away. By the late 1960s, Britain's bus industry was also looking for a new direction. For decades, bus manufacturing had been fragmented. Different operators used different chassis, different bodies, different layouts, different components, and different traditions. There was skill in that system. There was variety. There was local knowledge, but there was also complexity. A bus might be assembled from the work of several different firms. Operators had their own preferences. Designs varied widely. Maintenance could be complicated. Costs could rise. And in a country that still depended heavily on buses for everyday public transport, there was a growing belief that the industry needed something more standardized. The Leyland National was created to answer that need. It belonged to a very specific moment in British industrial thinking. British Leyland and the National Bus Company were both connected to the public sector world of the period. The goal was not simply to produce another vehicle. The goal was to create a national bus, a standardized single-decker that could be built in large numbers and used widely across the country. It was meant to simplify fleets. It was meant to reduce manufacturing complexity. It was meant to modernize public transport. And it was meant to bring mass production ideas from the car industry into a sector that still carried older, more labor-intensive traditions. That was the promise behind. Lillyhall, a modern bus, a modern factory, a modern production system, and a town ready to work. The Leyland National itself was instantly recognizable. It was not just a traditional chassis with a body placed on top. It was an integral design, with body and structure conceived as part of a single vehicle. Its rear engine, long windows, square profile, and roof-mounted pod gave it a look that became familiar across Britain. Some people admired it. Others disliked it. But almost everyone who used buses in Britain during the 1970s and 1980s encountered it. Passengers remembered the sound, the warmth, the steps, the seats, the engine note at the back, the particular feeling of standing in the aisle as the bus pulled away from a stop. Operators saw something different, a standardized machine that could be ordered, maintained and deployed across large fleets. And in Workington, every one of those buses meant hours of labor inside the factory. A bus began as parts, frames were handled, panels were fitted, wiring was routed, windows were installed, engines were mounted, seats were fixed into place, paint was applied, doors were tested, lights were checked. Inspectors looked over the finished vehicle before it left the plant for a working life somewhere else. One bus might go to a city depot, another might go to a rural route, another might serve commuters outside a railway station, or shoppers in a market town, or school children on a cold morning. The people who rode those buses rarely thought about Workington, but Workington's work was there, moving through their daily lives. That is the quiet power of manufacturing. A place can become part of millions of ordinary journeys without most people ever knowing its name. The ambition was enormous. Production at Lillyhall was planned at serious scale. This was not a small specialist manufacturer. It was a factory designed for volume. Reports at the time spoke of production beginning in the early 1970s, with targets that showed just how much confidence surrounded the project. The investment was also regional in meaning. The Lillyhall site was chosen partly because West Cumbria needed industrial renewal. Traditional industries such as steelmaking and mining were under pressure. The new bus plant was supposed to absorb skill, create employment, and prove that modern manufacturing could still belong in places outside the older centers of vehicle production. It was industrial policy made, physical, not a speech, not a promise on paper. Factory, a building with gates, machines, tools, shifts, wages, apprentices, and finished vehicles rolling out into the country. For Workington, this mattered deeply. The factory offered more than jobs. It offered continuity. It suggested that the town's industrial identity did not have to vanish with the decline of older trades. It could be reshaped. Instead of rails, buses. Instead of the old steel economy, a new transport economy. Instead of watching industry leave, Workington could watch a new product leave its own factory gates. And for a time, the vision worked. Thousands of Leyland Nationals were built. They became one of the defining British buses of their era. They appeared across the country and were exported overseas. The plant also became associated with later vehicles and related work, including Lynxes, Olympians, Titans, and railbus projects. This is why the Workington story cannot be reduced to simple failure. The factory did produce. The bus did matter. The Leyland National was influential, visible, and widely used. It changed the landscape of British public transport. It proved that Lillyhall could build at scale, but inside that success was a weakness. The plant had been designed for a particular kind of world, a world of large operators. A world of coordinated fleet planning, a world where public transport policy, manufacturing strategy, and national industrial ambition still appeared to move in the same direction. The Leyland National made sense in that world, but Britain was beginning to move into another one. From the late 1970s into the 1980s, the assumptions that had supported the project started to break apart. Public ownership was challenged. Industrial planning lost influence. Markets were opened. State industries were restructured, sold, or broken up. Bus services outside London were deregulated. The National Bus Company itself was divided and sold. The factory at Lillyhall had been built around stability. The market outside the gate became less stable. That change was crucial, because a bus factory does not survive on engineering alone. It survives on the structure of demand. It needs operators who can buy it, needs routes that are stable enough to justify investment. It needs predictable replacement cycles. It needs confidence. If bus companies know what their networks will look like, if finance is available, and if long-term fleet renewal makes commercial sense, then factories can plan. They can invest. They can retain skills. They can keep production lines moving. But when operators are uncertain, when competition changes the economics of routes, when companies delay purchases, when older vehicles are kept running longer, and when smaller or cheaper buses become attractive, a factory designed for volume can quickly find itself exposed. That is what happened to Workington. The deregulated bus market did not simply change how buses were operated. It changed what kind of buses were bought, when they were bought, and how much risk operators were willing to take. Some operators postponed fleet renewal, some searched for cheaper vehicles, some experimented with minibuses and minibuses, some were dealing with the financial pressures of privatization and management buyouts. Some were no longer thinking like public fleet managers. They were thinking like commercial survivors. The industry buying buses was no longer the same industry that the Leyland National had been built to serve, and that created a painful mismatch. Lillyhall had been designed for volume, standardization, and national coordination. The new market rewarded flexibility, cost control, and short-term adaptation. The factory tried to move with the times. It did not simply stop after the Leyland National. Later vehicles were produced. The plant continued to search for relevance. There were new models, new orders, and new hopes, but the ground beneath it had shifted. By the late 1980s, Leyland Bus had moved through ownership changes, including a management buyout and then Volvo ownership. For workers, Volvo's arrival could be seen as a source of hope. It was a major international manufacturer with engineering strength, global reach, and the resources that might secure the future. But ownership change is never only a change of name. It changes the place where decisions are made. It changes what counts as efficient. It changes which factories are central and which become peripheral. It changes whether a plant is viewed as a strategic asset, a regional responsibility, a legacy cost, or a production site that must justify itself against every other option in a multinational group. Workington had once made sense within a British industrial strategy. Now, it had to make sense inside a different corporate logic that did not make closure inevitable, but it made the question sharper. Was Lillyhall still essential? Were its products strong enough for the market ahead? Could its capacity be filled? Could the plant survive in a shrinking and uncertain British bus market? By the early 1990s, the answer became devastating. Volvo announced the closure of the Workington bus plant. Parliamentary discussion at the time described the loss of hundreds of jobs and the emptiness that would be left behind in a large modern factory. Contemporary reports pointed to falling demand, recession, heavy losses, and production volumes far below the plant's capacity. Those figures reveal the industrial trap. A factory built for volume needs volume. When demand falls too far, the same things that once made the plant efficient become burdens. The building is too large. The line is underused. The workforce is vulnerable. The fixed costs remain. Even when the orders disappear, capacity becomes pressure. Modernity becomes a liability. The factory that had been designed to represent the future suddenly looked too big for the market it had left. But closure is never only arithmetic. In Workington, it landed on a town that had already lived through older industrial losses. The bus plant had not been built merely as a commercial venture. It had also carried the hope of replacing work that was disappearing from coal, iron, and steel. So when Lillyhall declined, the wound was deeper. A replacement industry had itself become a lost industry. That is what gives the story its force. The tragedy of Workington is not that the Leyland National was a bad idea. It was not. It was ambitious, modern, and influential. The tragedy is not simply that a factory closed. Factories open and close in every industrial economy. The tragedy is that Britain built a strategic manufacturing asset in a town that needed renewal, tied it to a national transport vision, and then changed the conditions that had made that vision possible. The factory was asked to survive after the logic that created. It had been dismantled. That is why the decline cannot be blamed on one cause alone. It was not only deregulation. It was not only recession. It was not only Volvo. It was not only the product range. It was not only changing passenger habits, changing operator needs, or changing corporate priorities. It was the collision of all these forces. A plant built for one economic order found itself exposed to another. For workers, those forces were not abstract. They were felt in shifts. Rumors, meetings, notices, and uncertainty. They were felt in the fear of redundancy, the pressure on families, the question of whether young people would have to leave the area to find work, and the loss of pride that comes when skilled labor is no longer needed where it once mattered. For a town, a factory is not just a building, it is a clock. It sets the rhythm of mornings and evenings. It shapes bus routes, lunch breaks, apprenticeships, pubs, shops, mortgages, school choices, and the confidence of a place. When the gates close, the effect travels far beyond the payroll. The loss is economic, but it is also emotional. It changes how a town sees itself. It changes what parents imagine for their children. It changes what a young person thinks is possible without leaving. And yet the Workington story is not only about loss, it is also about what manufacturing means when it works. Every Leyland National that left, Lillyhall carried Workington outward. It moved through places where the factory workers might never go. It served passengers who would never know their names. It became part of the background of British life. A public bus is not like a private car hidden in a driveway. It is visible. It belongs to the street. It passes schools, shops, hospitals, depots, stations, factories, and estates. It connects lives that never meet. That made the Leyland National a strangely democratic product. It was ordinary, but important, unglamorous, but essential. People did not admire it the way they admired sports cars or luxury machines. They depended on it without thinking. And that is often where the real value of industry lies, not in spectacle, but in usefulness. Workington made useful things. Now first, rails, then buses. Both were about movement. Both linked the town to the wider country. Both turned local labor into national infrastructure. That continuity is what makes the closure so painful. The bus factory had not been some unrelated experiment. It belonged to a longer Workington story, a place making the things that allowed other places to move. When Lillyhall closed, Workington did not vanish. Towns are more resilient than the industries that employ them. People adapted. Some retrained, some retired, some moved, some found new work. Buildings were reused. The site became part of a different economy, but adaptation should not be confused with absence of loss. Something real disappeared. A chapter of skilled production ended. A symbol of industrial renewal failed to hold. A town that had once made rails for the world and buses for Britain had to absorb another break in its productive identity. That is why the story still matters. Workington's bus factory shows the limits of regeneration built around a single large employer. Even a modern factory, even a skilled workforce, even a nationally important product cannot survive if the wider ecosystem collapses around it. A factory is never just a factory. It is the visible surface of deeper systems. Suppliers, skills, transport policy, ownership, finance, public demand, corporate strategy, and trust. When those systems support one another, industry can grow. When they pull apart, even a good factory can be left stranded. Lillyhall needed many things to remain aligned. It needed public transport policy that supported fleet renewal. It needed operators with confidence to buy. It needed product strategy that matched the market. It needed owners committed to the plant. It needed national and regional policy to work with corporate decision-making rather than against it. For a while, those conditions existed. Then they weakened. Then they broke. And the people who had the least control over that process were the ones whose lives depended most directly on the factory. Today, preserved Leyland Nationals still appear at transport rallies, heritage events, and collections. They are no longer just working buses. They are historical objects. People restore them, photograph them, drive them carefully, and remember the world they came from. Their square bodies and familiar lines now carry a different meaning. They remind us of a moment when Britain believed it could standardize, modernize and manufacture a better public transport future. They also remind us that industrial strategy cannot stop at building a factory. It has to protect the conditions that allow the factory to keep making sense. Workington's bus factory was born from a promise that a town shaped by old industry could find a place in the new one. For a time, that promise had wheels, engines, windows, seats, doors, destination boards, and a route number. Then the route changed, and the factory that once helped move Britain was left behind. If stories like Workington's matter to you, subscribe to the channel because every forgotten factory has a story worth remembering.